On behalf of Professor Christians and McGill University Faculty of Law, we'd like to welcome you all to the 2021 Stephen Spiegel Colloquium. Our guest today is Professor Irma Johanna Mosquera Valderrama, and we are so excited to have her join us today and share her book chapter on global tax governance that will be subsequently published in the Oxford Handbook on International Tax. Professor Irma Johanna Mosquera Valderrama is a full professor in tax governance and a PhD dean at Leiden University in the Netherlands. For her PhD research, she was a Fulbright scholar at New York University and the University of Florida. Prior to joining Leiden University, Professor Mosquera Valderrama worked as a tax advisor, a lecturer across many Dutch universities, and a postdoctoral researcher. Her areas of expertise include international tax law and comparative tax law in developed and developing countries. Recently, Professor's research has focused on the exchange of information and BEPS-related issues in developing countries. She is currently the lead researcher of the European Research Council ERC-funded project, Globe TaxGov. So a little bit about the format of our colloquium today will be as follows. Greg and I will be your moderators for today. Professor Mosquera Valderrama will first present her book chapter. At the end of the presentation, Greg will then open the floor to participants for questions. Attendees can feel free to send us directly their questions via chat, though we encourage you to ask your questions directly using the raise hand function. We find this makes for a more exciting and engaging discussion. So without further ado, we will turn it over to Professor Mosquera Valderrama, and we are so excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alison, for the invitation. I see a lot of familiar faces, Scott, Leandra, Tarcisio, and of course, my PhDs, Frederick and Juliana. So thank you so much for being here. This is kind of like what has become my chair since 3 weeks ago. So I'm still, the topic is not new. I have been working on this, but it is kind of a nice opportunity to first discuss what is this about global tax governance. That is also part of the research project of the Globe TaxGov, what we have also started three years ago here at Leiden University. One of the things, perhaps when you read the book chapter, you see that there is a lot of discussion on what is global tax governance, what is international tax cooperation. And I also try to highlight what the political scientists have done on that, but at the same time, what tax scholars have discussed on issues of sovereignty, competition, tax governance, and so forth, and look from that perspective, the recent developments, international taxation. For the presentation, I will do it differently, because I will start first with what the international tax law developments, and then after I will say about the global tax governance, and then after we will discuss about some of my favorite topics on input and output legitimacy. For the ones who have read some of my articles, normally I do like to approach it from that perspective. However, I do not want this to be only me, and I know that I will touch a lot of things like developing countries, sustainable development. So I truly, truly hope that a lot of people will jump. I'm looking at Alison right now, so she will jump on sustainable development. So it will be nice to have a kind of interactive and try to think why is that we need to talk about global tax governance, but also at the same time, why is that this is now a problem? What is failing right now? I mean, we see all international tax developments. We see it in Pillar 1, Pillar 2 right now, but still we are saying this is not enough. So what is happening here? So let's take a look to the past, the future, and what we are right now. So of course, we started with bank secrecy, and of course, we started the discussions in the UK Parliament about paying the fair share of multinationals. And the discussion at the UK Parliament were saying what you are not doing is not illegal, but is immoral. And that discussion between the morality and the legality and the aggressive tax plan in the tax, of course, a lot of problems, and especially in the discussion of the fair share by multinationals. And of course, thereafter, we have the project of BEPS, and then we started with the base erosion profit shifting, based also on the developments of exchange of information, included FATCA and the Common Reporting Standard. And nowadays, we have the digital economy. The question is then, we can see it from different perspectives. And I think that at the end of this presentation, hopefully, you see how different the perspectives are in analyzing these developments. So of course, the OECD, the G20, the EU always talk about the global, fair, sustainable, and modern tax systems. But the civil society focus more on the fairness, the fair share by multinationals. When we start discussing about what is fair taxation, what is fair tax competition, what is sustainable, then start a lot of discussions, because even though we are talking about fair share, we are talking about sustainability, there are still problems in the concept of fairness, in the concept of sustainability. So this aims, in a way, you may see, well, one civil society is more towards fair share, international organizations, and the EU more to sustainable and fair, global fair, whatever that means, because I will see with the standard of tax governance that this is kind of a challenge. And then, of course, we start with, in order to deal with these instruments, with, of course, before this, we started with the League of Nations, the financial crisis, the change of information, but we have the BEPS, and we have the BEPS 2.0. This BEPS 2.0 that is called, in a way, I just put it just 2.0 to distinguish from the BEPS, but of course, the Pillar 1 and the Pillar 2, and the recent statement of the G20 approved by also some 137 of the countries of the BEPS inclusive framework. So the question right now is how this has taken place. And in principle, if we are focused only on BEPS, we all know that it was about the BEPS 44 group and OECD, G20, OECD accession countries, but that non-OECD, non-G20 countries were invited to participate on equal footing, whatever that means, because then you start all the questions. And we have now 141 tax jurisdictions. And the last one is Mauritania, that, by the way, it did not only accept it to become member of the BEPS inclusive framework, but immediately became also endorsed the statement on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 from the October 2021. So when we look at that, and we say the EU, remember I mentioned to you, there is this global, this fair, this sustainable. The European Union also wants to have a power, a role in these developments. So the European Union has also decided we are going to develop this standard of good tax governance. But this standard, even though at the beginning was more about transparency, exchange of information, fair tax competition, since 2018 is also about the BEPS for minimum standards. And one of the problems that we have there is not only about that the standard of good tax governance asks non-European countries to commit to the BEPS for minimum standards, so they need to implement it, but at the same time to receive a positive review. So then these non-European countries will not only need to participate in the BEPS inclusive framework or commit to the BEPS for minimum standards, but we need to have a positive review. You may have a lot of questions on this. How is the value of this standard? How the European Union is going to analyze or enforce this? And what normally happens is that the European Union, the European Commission concludes agreements, trade agreements, partnership agreements with non-European countries. We see also with the ACP, the ASEAN, Caribbean, Pacific countries, but we are also seeing with African countries, and they decide to introduce this standard of good tax governance. At the same time, it is also useful, this standard of good tax governance, for in case that countries want to make to have access to European funding. So what you see is that normally, even though we started with this discussion of BEPS being discussed and approved and then taken by the OECD G20, being extended to the BEPS inclusive framework to participate on equal footing, at the same time, we have from the European Union perspective, also this standard of good tax governance that goes beyond the BEPS inclusive framework, because also has this positive review. One of the things that you can say also is, but this is topic perhaps for another presentation, is about how the European Union has taken the BEPS, has imported the BEPS for minimum standards, and at the same time has exported these BEPS minimum standards with an additional condition. That is, in this case, the peer review, for instance. And this kind of importing these BEPS for minimum standards But also you can see it, for instance, toward third countries. You see it also in the tax avoidance directive, especially the anti-tax avoidance directive number 2, that provides for hybrid mismatches with third non-European countries. So this kind of raise a lot of issues, but I will try to move a little towards the purpose of what we want to address here. So, of course, we will start first with global tax governance, and it's also the title of this lecture, but also the title of a book chapter, and we will go to the input and output legitimacy. As you have seen in this chapter, I try to think about why is that we in tax law are discussing issues of global tax governance, and whether we can call it global tax governance or whether it's something else. So I'm still trying to search how to reconcile this discussion in political science and tax law. And we came, of course, with the definition, of course, from Thomas Rixen and Peter Dish on global tax governance. And in a way, this global tax governance was discussed from political science, like the full or partial shift of the power to tax from countries towards international organizations. In a way, it was what the developments take, for instance, with the change of information. When we started looking at the change of information and we started looking whether it's really for the countries to take decisions after the financial crisis, or it is for the international organizations. And normally you will see the OECD with the political mandate of the G20 is discussing issues of a change of information. The OECD with the political mandate of the G20 is also discussing the BEPS, and so forth. So the question is whether in this shift of power towards international organizations, what we are missing there? What is the problem that we have there right now? So are we really saying that it is legitimate to bring this shift of power towards international organizations? And on the other hand, also I can say as a country, you know, like when your mother says to you, you need to eat your vegetables because it will be good for you. So then the developing countries may say, yeah, well, if it's good for me, why not? Why I cannot have this shift of power? I will give part of my power towards the international organizations. But are really the vegetables that good for you? And I know Alisa will have a say on this afterwards. But that's the question. So because if we look at this global tax governance, and let's take a step back and see what the other tax scholars before me have discussed it about this shift of power from countries towards international organizations and these developments. So for instance, we have Browner, who provided with a need for a multilateral tax treaty, and we're talking way before BEPS, way before the financial crisis. And we also have Allison, of course, with the hard law and soft law in international taxation, whether governments really are following certain practices, in this case, of course, about harmful tax competition. And we have also Diane, who also deal with the concept of sovereignty, and whether sovereignty will influence the responses to tax competition. So whether there is an issue of sovereignty, and of course, Ana Paula Durado, who for the first time was the first one who say the validity of the global standards, in this case, a change of information. So there are some kind of analysis from tax scholars where they started to look at these developments. And at that time, for instance, where the transfer pricing guidelines, where the harmful tax competition report, it was the possibility to have the UN, the OECD model, the possibility discussion of having a multilateral tax treaty. But thereafter, with the change of information, started the discussion of whether it was still valid for these international organizations to decide on all the countries and what needed to be done. What is also important to realize is that with the change of information, we change from, in principle, the change of information is about assistance, administrative assistance and cooperation between tax administrations. So you will say there is no problem with that. I mean, at the end of the day, it is still the tax administration, the one who will do the tax auditing, is the tax administration who will do all the control, so it will be fine. But when we are talking about BEPS, it's completely different. because it's not only about assistance between tax administrations, but it is about having rules and the countries being required to implement domestic laws to implement the BEPS, but at the same time to introduce new provisions in the tax treaties, and at the same time be invited to participate in multilateral instruments, and at the same time to change their tax system. So it's no longer about what the tax administrations will do with that information, like a change of information, but it is about what the lawmaker, the tax administration, the judges, the business, tax advisors, how they will implement this information. And this is where it comes, for instance, what we are doing with our project in GloveTaxGov. We are looking whether this role of the stakeholders has changed the implementation of the BEPS for minimum standards. And of course, Alison did for IFA in Rio also a description of as a general reporter together with Steve Che, a general description on implementation of BEPS, but we see that after these years, there is a lot of more implementation. So if you feel free to interrupt me anytime, I'm just keeping my motto. But what we also see is that there were new changes. And these new changes also came in the scholarship, and not only with the article I wrote on input and output legitimacy, where I use political science theories, but we also, of course, Ivan Osai, who you know and have also participated in the tax policy colloquium, Sid Kidma, and of course, Tarcisio, who is also, I believe, in this presentation. The question is whether if all countries cooperate, then there will be global tax governance. So are we saying that if all countries, OECD, G20, non-OECD, non-G20 countries, then we are achieving global tax governance? And I thought it is very interesting to see the analysis between what is cooperation and what is global tax governance. Because even though the title of my chair is tax governance, even though the title of the project is global tax governance, I'm not sure if actually we really can talk about global tax governance. And the reason is because we see that sometimes we discuss about this topic of global tax governance, but who is the one who is now, are the international organizations saying, we achieve this cooperation, we achieve this, so we have global tax governance? Because, you know, when you look at the website of the OECD, you will always look together. Today, we have one member more who is committed. And sometimes you see countries like, why? You wonder why that country is a member of the BEPS inclusive framework. What happened here? And the question is, and I thought it was interesting that an article from Ian Hurt, International Relations, where he's saying actually global tax governance is the way that we use of this terminology that we use to impose outcomes on the people. And it's the way that the international organizations, and in this case, of course, the role of the OECD G20 is not about cooperation anymore, but it is about imposition. And this is important because I do think that unless that we have the questions clear, then we do not have the answers. And when I started this project on global tax governance, for me it was obvious that it's global tax governance, and this is input and output, and this is but I'm not sure anymore. So it doesn't mean that they will not take my chair away from later, hopefully, but we need to ask these questions. It's really the cooperation achieving, meaning global tax governance. So it will be interesting to analyze it also from this perspective. At the same time, here you have a list of reading for your free time and whenever you have. So here is one of the case of international tax cooperation, and the others, of course, some of you already know. So the question that we have now, and we go to the legitimacy deficits. So as I mentioned to you, and you know already, the OECD, the G20, BEPS 44, the question is then, what happens with this BEPS inclusive framework? And the problem is that there is a lot of analysis in this BEPS inclusive framework, for instance, about the usefulness of the peer review, but also the limited input from countries for the peer review. And at the same time, whether there are mismatches and the use of the MLI and countries who decide, actually, we are not going to do it through the multilateral instrument, we are doing bilaterally. But also, it was interesting to see these two reports in 2019, especially at the time that it was kind of 3-4 years after the BEPS inclusive framework started, where they also kind of criticized or brought the attention to the fact that actually this BEPS project is not solving all of the problems of developing countries, and that, of course, there will be still other problems. And we are not even talking about the digital economy. We are just staying here with BEPS as such. And at the same time, one of the things we have also discussed, and Alison has also discussed it, is whether this really BEPS in terms of bring more domestic resource mobilization, but also create other helps to other sustainable development goals. And for the ones who attended the UN meetings in October, they see that one of the presentations, especially the first presentation from the UN, was about the sustainable development goals, but it wasn't only about domestic resource mobilization, but was about inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels, about regional partnerships, about transparent institutions. So when we look at this, and we look at the whole process of BEPS as such, we may have 3 question marks. First of all, what is the role of the peer review? Are countries participating in this peer review? What is the role of the MLI? Are still different needs, the needs of the developing countries being addressed? We already know that there are some needs like informal economy, and also whether there is alignment between the BEPS and the sustainable development goals. If we go a little further and we look at the participation, and this is, I think, this is the part where I'm more passionate about, because when we look at how I have been trying the last 2-3 years to highlight that the participation sometimes is lacking, sometimes exists, but it is not well reasoned. So even if you go and you participate in the BEPS inclusive framework, you cannot really provide any content, you cannot really provide any discussion. Could be because you do not have the technical knowledge, could be because you do not speak English, or could be because you don't in such a big audience network when it's the BEPS inclusive framework, when the meetings are taking place. And at the same time, the question is also about the content in terms of and the coordination between tax administration and Minister of Finance. Because sometimes when you see, especially in developing countries, it will be sometimes the Minister of Finance, the one who will go and attend these meetings, but then we'll have to go to the tax administration, and the tax administration say, we cannot implement this. But also, I mean, even it happened in the Netherlands, where the Netherlands was, the Minister of Finance was going for the multilateral instrument with almost no reservations. But the Dutch Parliament say, no, you need to go back and give a reservation on the commissionary arrangements. Because until we do not have a dispute resolution, we cannot agree on commissionary arrangements for the permanent establishment. So the question about this participation and whether there is a coordination, whether there is content, whether, and you also see the BEPS is now, countries are still trying to grasp BEPS. They are still trying to introduce the standards. And now we are talking about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, another multilateral convention, other rules, and the countries are wondering how much we are going to have, because there was a statement this week from some African countries under the, some Latin American countries and some Caribbean countries under the president, the guidance of the Minister of Finance in Jamaica, where actually they were saying that this week, that is still country by country reporting is a nightmare, that they cannot even implement this. So then the question is, do they really have all the participation? They can also really have this more time that can be given for these meetings. So at the same time, when we look at this, we look at the participation of the peer review minimum standards, and we see how to make it effective. And the question is, are really the countries providing input to this? And if you see, for instance, we discussed that in Oxford when it was possible to have this kind of conference in person, and I was already looking at the peer review and looking at the lack of input from developing countries on the peer review. So this kind of brings a question about the participation. And of course, I always like to, there is here King Jacinto Henares, and why I think always this is important, because King Jacinto Henares was in the tax administration, was participating in the BEPS discussion in the BEPS inclusive framework, but King Jacinto Henares decided, actually, this is not good for Philippines. So they decided not to do it. But because of the AU standard of good tax governance, now Philippines has asked the AU to review them on Action 5. So the OECD, so the Philippines has asked the AU, asked the OECD to review us in Action 5, because they are negotiating this kind of trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, so they need to be now reviewed. So the question is, even though you say no, because it's not good for you, the AU standard of good tax governance is bringing pressure towards developing countries, and mainly in Africa, African countries and Asian countries, of Latin American countries, to still commit to these 4 minimum standards, and remember, to have a positive peer review. If I may say also about the peer review, and one of the things I also like to highlight is about the peer review on, is supposed to be the equal footing of the BEPS inclusive framework, and therefore the peer review should be also be equal footing. However, it is not. It is the consensus -1 rule. And the reason is because you want to make sure that the country will still be able to, the country who is being peer review, if they object to these discussions, you can still, that the peer review report will be approved. And that's the reason how, for instance, in Uruguay and in Switzerland, the bank secrecy was being taken out of change it, because even though Uruguay say we don't want to change it, the peer review came saying, Uruguay, you need to change your bank secrecy rules. And that also happens with the BEPS 4 minimum standards. Okay, Bianca, how much time do I have?
You can take as much time as you want, Professor.
Oh my gosh, no, don't tell me, because I can talk for hours. No, just kidding. But anyway, if we look at the participation, and then I will want to perhaps discuss a little about the taxation and sustainability at this moment. And the reason why I do that is because if we are discussing about the BEPS for minimum standards, and we are discussing, remember, about the beginning, global, fair, sustainable tax systems, the question is how we can link this taxation to sustainability, and how we can link it to the good governance. And in that case, one of the things that we also see is that actually there is not clear about the sustainability. And it is, of course, not clear about how this is linked to the sustainable development. We always talk about domestic resource mobilizations, but at the same time, we are not really discussing, for instance, what is the economic impact of the BEPS? How much revenue the countries have received? And that's one of the problems that we have, because even though they say BEPS is good for all countries, we do not still have the numbers of how much of this is good and how much of the governments are taken. And of course, the question is how to assess whether BEPS contributes to this sustainable development agenda. And what I mentioned to you, what is interesting about the UN, not really discussing about domestic resource mobilization anymore, but in the UN Tax Committee discussions this in October, was about transparency, regional partnerships, sustainable, this kind of regional partnerships, cooperation. So going a little further than this. So they see that taxation has also a role on that. And of course, Alison has written also some topics in that with Tarcisio on how to link this taxation and sustainability. So the question is, and we may have here 4 questions, and the first one is, where the sustainable development goals the interests of developing countries to attract investment considered through the BEPS process? That's one question. The another one is how the implementation of BEPS will contribute to achieve the SDGs. Whether there are issues outside the BEPS that will also be useful for the developing countries for the sustainable development agenda. How this approach, so this technical assistance is holistic and inclusive, and whether it relates to, for instance, what we discussed in our book on tax and development by Wouter Leaps and Dries Lesage, a chapter on the medium-term revenue strategies, where you really make sure that instead of having short-term, you have a medium-term, but also that you, in this kind of strategies, of in this kind of decisions, decision-making, you will take still for a long term. So some of these questions are in taxation and sustainability, but have not been yet addressed by the OECD and had not been yet addressed by the Platform for Collaboration. At the same time, we do have these toolkits. We have the OECD, the UN discussions, the OECD model, the UN model. But I do think that if we do not address these questions, we cannot really know whether these vegetables are good for me, yes or no. Remember? So now Alison will say, it's just Pepsi became a vegetable. Okay, so I want to conclude with this kind of thoughts about some solutions. One of the things that strike me a little and kind of worries me is that normally when you see people in the tax administration and you see people who are very capable, people who are very technical, people who receive a lot of information, training and so forth, but they leave. After 2-3 years, they say, well, I got a job in a tax advisory, I got a job in international organization, and they leave. And one of the questions that I always have is how we can make sure that these people stay, how we can make sure that more people are educated, that more people get this training, that more people get this information, that more people get this expertise. And at the same time, we need to have, and we need to make sure that there is also training and coordination within the tax administration. I always mention that I met one person from the BEPS from Costa Rica in the BEPS Inclusive Framework. And this person said, well, I asked, are you going to the meeting of the Inter-American Center of Tax Administrations? This person said, actually, I don't know about that meeting. But I met from the same country another person from the Inter-American Center, but they didn't know about each other. But both of them work at the tax administration. So they attend 2 meetings, they could exchange ideas. I was lucky that I was able to attend both, but they do not know each other. So there is a lot of problems in the communication and the coordination within the tax administration, and of course with also the Minister of Finance. Also, what I think is that we have not given so much the role to regional tax organizations. Of course, ATAF, the African Tax Administration Forum, has worked a lot on topics of now for digital Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, but also with different technical assistance and so forth. But one of the things that what I always think is that there is almost no role from regional tax organizations on peer reviews and how to make sure that the countries that are being chosen are because of the region, how to make sure that regional tax organizations will also provide input to the peer review reports. And of course, what is the role of regional tax organizations and academic expert groups, and the question of whether the UN should lead the discussions? And I really do not know. Because I know sometimes people say, yes, the UN should be, but then you think, well, we now have a new mandate of the UN Committee of Fiscal Affairs, of UN Committee, the Expert Tax Committee, but what have changed since then? And is not the UN Tax Committee being a little late in the discussion? Now we are talking about COVID, but this was discussed like last year also with the OECD. I mean, I remember we organized a conference in tax incentives and COVID in June, and the OECD haven't even come with a proposal. And the question is now, 1 year later, you see the UN Tax Committee discussing about COVID. And then I think you may be a little too late to the party, if this is a party, because I don't know, I'm still trying to figure out whether there is a party here. And I think that these are some of the thoughts I have in this global tax governance. What is also important, and final comment, is to try to have all the stakeholders. So it's not only about international organizations, it's not only about the G20 of the G24, G77, but it's also about business associations, civil society, academics. And sometimes I hope that in all the activities that we also organize within the Global Tax Gov project, at least we can bring this kind of discussions and from different perspectives, because at the end of the day, we may not have one institution or one person the answers, but we can look for them if we cooperate. So this is more or less my presentation. Thank you so much. I will just stop sharing so we can have a nice discussion.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. This was a fantastic presentation. If everyone could just, I invite everyone to give a round of virtual applause